everyone, my name is Stella Ress. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of History at USI. You can reach me if you have any questions or comments about this presentation either through the symposium or by emailing me at sress@usi.edu or even tweeting at me. I am at Stella Ress. So today I'm going to present to you about the topic An Old Man's Darling, Gold Diggers, Sugar Daddies, and Age-Disparate Relationships in the United States from 1890 to 1930. And, I think it's fair to say that there are a few things more filthy than some might think than an old man dating a young woman. So I hope you see the connection then to our Filth and Foulness colloquium. All right, perhaps first written down in the 16th century, a popular adage advises young women to marry age over youth. Better to be an old man's darling, it counsels, than a young man's slave. Reproduced with little variance for hundreds of years, this seemingly simple axiom suggests a rather complex relationship between men and women. It notes that an old man is sure to make a good husband as he will proudly dote upon his younger wife. A young man, on the other hand, is a poor choice, because either through accident or design, a woman is sure to be enslaved in such a marriage to him. Indeed, historian Stephanie Kuntz argues that since its creation, traditional marriage, organized the division of labor and power by gender and age, confirmed men's authority over women. Practices developed in the pre-classical world and propagated by society since then ensured that within marriage men had most, if not all, the power. Wives, therefore, did what they were told, or risked physical, mental, and or emotional punishment if they failed to follow the wishes of their husbands. Kuntz explains, men were not in families, they ruled over them. Thus, it is not surprising that in an attempt to gain autonomy and authority within a relationship, young women were advised to marry older men whose authority was undermined by their advanced years. By the 19th century, however, this proverb was transformed into sarcastic tales of an old man's darling who marries, if her dreams come true, Prince Charming, a nice feeble widower around 70 with a few millions in negotiable securities and no near relatives who would be mean enough to contest a real love match. Eventually, according to another version, she's an old man's darling and he's her willing slave. The meaning of this adage has been reversed. The old man's darling had changed from a woman looking for a suitable match to a young one eager to exploit an elderly gent and his money. In turn, the old man has lost status as well as he went from a protector to a slave. This transformation in this simple phrase suggests that there was a revolution in attitudes with regard to how society viewed young women, old men, and the relationships they formed. The media firestorms generated by two of the most infamous age-discrepant romances of the early 20th century demonstrate this shift and hint at the potential reasons behind it. So today I'm going to introduce you to the tragic love triangle between Evelyn Nesbit, Stanford White, and Harry Kendall Thaw, as well as to the scandalous relationship between Frances Bell Heenan and Edward West Browning. Despite the fact that in important ways these cases are similar, for example, they revolve around two 16-year-old financially strapped women with actress ambitions, wooed by wealthy middle-aged men 3+ decades older than themselves. Ultimately, they were discussed in the press differently. The principals in the White-Nesbit-Thaw affair, over on the right, confused the public. Their ages and their genders were certainly discussed, but not in black and white terms. The same, however, cannot be said in the Browning-Heenan case on the left, where Browning in particular was ridiculed because of his age, and Heenan was not spared because of hers. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the first case study. Evelyn Nesbit was a 16-year-old girl when 48-year-old architect and man about town, Stanford White, first took notice of her in the late summer of 1901. She was a model, indeed the model Gibson girl, an aspiring actress, and a chorus girl who performed in the famed Florodora troupe. And there's a picture of her as the literal Charles Dana Gibson girl, right? The famous Gibson girls of the 1890s and early 1900s. Meanwhile, Stanford White was a successful architect in the renowned firm McKim, Mead, and White, the mastermind behind such architectural marvels as the Washington Square Arch in New York City's Washington Square Park, Astor Courts in Rhinebeck, New York, and of course, New York City's second Madison Square Garden, where White met his untimely and violent death. White was also a family man, married to Bessie White, née Smith, for over 15 years, and the father of a teenage boy. At that time, his reputation as a skilled and prodigious architect was not yet eclipsed by his sordid personal life and frequent infidelities. Though today theirs is one of the most infamous romantic May-December relationships in U.S. history, the affair between Stanford White and Evelyn Nesbit would probably have been kept a secret had White lived to old age, as he reportedly paid generously to keep his name and his bawdy behavior out of the papers. As fate would have it, however, White was murdered, and by Nesbit's husband, Harry Kendall Thaw. Thaw was the son of Pittsburgh coal tycoon William Thaw and his wife Mary Copley. By most accounts, Harry Kendall Thaw was spoiled, eccentric, and insane. Rumors that he and his mother used their money to keep him, and his fetish for whipping young men and women out of both prison and papers, abounded. Why Evelyn Nesbit accepted his marriage proposal has been a question of debate for over a century, but the couple married in a private service on April 4th, 1905. 14 months later, White was dead, Thaw was a murderer, and Nesbit was the key witness in her husband's trial. On June 26, 1906, while watching a show atop the Madison Square roof garden, the giant red-headed artistic genius Stanford White was gunned down by the, quote, plainly nervous and pale, end quote, multimillionaire husband of Evelyn Nesbit, Harry Kendall Thaw. After firing 3 shots into the back of White's head, so this isn't exactly an accurate depiction here in the Evening Telegram, but after firing 3 shots into the back of White's head, Thaw raised his gun and dismantled it. He walked over to his wife, where, in response to her look of horror, he simply stated, "It's all right, dear. I have probably saved your life." He was promptly and calmly carted off to the Tenderloin station. Many eyewitnesses, including Edward H. Convey, a foreman at the Madison Square Garden, who later testified in the ensuing trials, claimed to have heard Thaw declare, quote, "You ruined my life," or "my wife." Newspapers, however, jumped on the latter statement and started speculating immediately, as you can see here. The day of the murder, for example, the New York Times ran a title story called "Thaw Murders Stanford White. He Ruined My Wife," witness says. And the Los Angeles Times ran a 2-page article subtitled "Young Pittsburgh Millionaire Defends His Wife." Not surprisingly, quickly rumors spread throughout the press that, quote, "Thaw's wife has a secret." Days later, more details flooded in. The World sensationally and bluntly printed, quote, "Many young women tell in affidavits of orgies in which they took part with the architect Stanford White and his intimate friends," end quote. The New York Times even boasted to know that, quote, "White drugged, ruined, and insulted," end quote, Evelyn Nesbit. Indeed, in her testimony, Nesbit claimed that years before she had even met her husband, White repeatedly wined, dined, drugged, and raped her. Now, difficult though it may hear, the truth regarding White and whether or not he was a degenerate or a gentleman matters little for my purposes for this specific study. What does matter, however, is how he, Nesbit, and Thaw were judged, not by a lawful jury or judge. We already know what the outcome there, but rather by the American people themselves, who kind of vacillated back and forth. And this is because it helps to reveal American attitudes about intergenerational pairings and those who engaged in them at the turn of the 20th century. In the media firestorm that revolved around the Thaw murder trial, Stanford White was rarely depicted in black and white terms, though he was indeed a polarizing figure. White was alternately described by his contemporaries as anywhere between a most kind-hearted, most considerate, gentle, and manly man to a moral pervert who richly deserved his fate. In some accounts, he was a sexual miscreant who got what he had coming. Vanity Fair even ran an article about White, sensationally titled, "Voluptuary and Pervert Dies the Death of a Dog." Yet that was not the whole story. Indeed, it is only half, as every person who attacked White was countered by another who rallied to his defense. Nesbit herself, right, and a victim, alleged victim, even described him as both a kind and tender man, but also one who was infinitely mean and who preyed upon the defenseless. In her autobiography, Nesbitt referred to him as a benevolent vampire. Years after his death, and at the dedication of the Stanford White Memorial doors at New York's University's library in December of 1921, quote, a group of friends and admirers gathered in his honor. They saluted not just White's artistic achievements, but also his character. Thomas Hastings, an architect, claimed that the tribute was, quote, not only to White's genius, but also to his lovable and generous character. Art historian and critic Royal Corazos also stated, quote, those of us who loved him are proud to stand up and be counted in devotion to his name, end quote. Clearly, White was neither wholly evil nor innocent. According to the prosecutor at his murder trial, quote, that Stanford White had his faults and his gross faults, who would deny? But there is a difference between unchastity and brutality, he continued. There is a difference between the man who errs and the man who brutally despoils. Though some judged him harshly, others were kind. The media also had a hard time at painting a unified picture of the murderer, Thaw. They alternated between calling him a mad killer or a knight in shining armor. According to defense attorneys and to some of the public who followed the case, Thaw was not a murderer. He was a protector of young girls. Although Thaw did not even know Nesbitt when her sexual relationship with White occurred, when she recounted the tragic tale to her husband, reportedly he snapped. From that moment on, Thaw followed an unwritten law that dictated, in the words of his defense attorney, Delphin P. Delmas, that, quote, whoever invades the sanctity of his home, whoever stains the virtue of his wife, has fortified the protection of human laws and must look to the eternal justice and mercy of God, end quote. Thaw was tried twice. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second, with a verdict of, quote, not guilty because of insanity at the time of the act, end quote. Now, perhaps the hardest character and description that the press had to pin down was that of Nesbitt. Indeed, in the media coverage and within the trials, the description of Evelyn Nesbitt vacillated between that of a child and that of a young woman, depending on the situation where her age was brought in or used as a qualifier. When the papers and trial reporters talked of Nesbitt in the courtroom, for example, she was almost always described as a child. On the first day of her damning testimony, she was, quote, dressed in a blue frock. She seemed pale, looked a little more than a child, and the picture of complete innocence, end quote. And when she recounted the night of her rape, the newspaper said that, quote, she toddled as innocently into the arms of Satan as an infant into the outstretched arms of parental love, end quote. She had, quote, a high childish treble, and one needed little imagination to visualize her as a child, a little girl, telling a fairy tale that was about to turn into a nightmare, end quote. Moreover, when comparing her to the aged White, the defense portrayed her time and time again as a child. Thus, in his closing arguments, Delphin Delmas referred to Nesbitt as a faded child, an innocent flower, a fatherless child, and a girl who fell victim to the lust of a gray-haired man. Clearly, when trying to either gain sympathy for Nesbitt and or in attempts to emphasize White's supposed crime, Nesbitt needed to play the part of a defenseless, innocent, and naive child. At other times, however, Nesbitt was required or pushed to mature quickly. Cognizant of the defense strategy to infantilize Nesbitt, thereby presumably making her a more sympathetic and therefore more believable witness, the prosecutors tried to ruin her credibility by recasting her not only as an adult, but also as a cunning seductress who pitted two men against each other to reap financial benefits. William Travers Jerome, the lead prosecutor and district attorney, harshly cross-examined Nesbitt. He brought in photos of the 15-year-old Nesbitt modeling in clothes much similar to the ones that she wore in the court nearly a decade later. Essentially, he wanted to show the jury that Nesbitt was deceiving them by dressing as a child when she was, in fact, a woman of 23. Nesbitt was able to vacillate easily between child and adult because the age lines were not quite as hardened as they would become following more strict compulsory schooling laws and child labor laws that were adopted or more strictly enforced years after the affair. Once age stratification started really taking root, Nesbitt's victim image died. Indeed, though most of the papers, and perhaps consequently the public, was on Nesbit's side during and immediately following the trial, as the scandal faded into the background and Nesbit lived long enough to see her charms fade and her star forgotten, she was once again recast in this tragic triangle. This time, from victim to vixen, from exploited sex slave to cunning gold digger. In most of the literature about Nesbit published in the last half of the 20th century, for example, Nesbit had been the target of abuse and described as money hungry, or worse. In the 1981 Oscar nominated musical Ragtime, based off of the 1975 book by the same name, for example, Evelyn Nesbit sings about her fame generated by the two men in her life. Evelyn exclaims that although, quote, Harry's in trouble and Stanley's in heaven, Evelyn is in vaudeville. If you've ever seen it, it kind of sounds like that. And again, that Evelyn gets publicity. And in J. Robert Nash's Murder Among the Rich and Famous, Celebrity Slangs That Shocked America, published in 1983, Nash described Nesbit as, quote, a clever vixen who schemed her way into two fortunes and through incredibly involved intrigues of her own subtle design, brought about one of America's most scandalous high society murders. End quote. Thus, though in 1906 Evelyn was simply an unfortunate victim caught in the web spun by her financially motivated mother, her perverted benefactor, and her sadistic husband, by 1975 Evelyn is remembered as not only a gold digger, but also as someone who may have also gotten away with murder. Another May-December romance helps to demonstrate this shift. In 1926, when Edward West Browning, aka Daddy, married Frances Belle Heenan, aka Peaches, he was a sprightly 51-year-old eccentric millionaire, and she was a slack-jawed 16-year-old high school dropout. 15-year-old. Oh wait, when they married, she was 16, sorry. But when they met, she was 15. Now, despite the predictions that the marriage would not last, Browning was ecstatic with his young bride, and she, as evidenced by the bright, toothy grin she usually flashed photographers on her spending sprees, was just as happy with the union. Perhaps surprising to none save Browning, within a few months of their nuptials, Heenan deserted him. In the ensuing divorce trial, she testified that Daddy Browning was a sexual pervert who forced her to walk around the house naked, introduced an African honking gander into the bedroom in a bid for a bizarre menage a trois, I have no idea, and was suspiciously close to his young adopted daughter. Daddy countered that Peaches was not faithful to him, that she refused to perform her wifely duties, and, he suspected, made up lies about him to get his millions. In a bizarre twist of fate, the judge granted their legal separation, but denied them a divorce, deciding it would appear as if the two deserved each other. From start until finish, the papers and the public followed the love affair diligently, with both amusement and disgust. By and large, the public was up in arms over their union. According to Browning, he received constant threats, and Heenan herself was in fact attacked with acid, forever scarring her face and neck. And you can see the bandage there on the right side of her jaw. In addition to threats and actions of bodily harm, their courtship also sparked an investigation into the legality of their actions in particular, as well as such marriages in the state of New York in general. The country was abuzz over this marriage, not just because of the personalities of the parties involved, but also because both the aging Browning and the young Heenan, in contrast to White and Nesbit, lived in a time of greater age stratification, and both did not act out the traditional gender norms of their respective ages. For these reasons, they were targets of public humiliation and abuse. The more Browning and Heenan shared about their relationship publicly, the more the public wanted to hear. They became daily fodder for the tabloids and newspaper men and women who dogged them and documented all of their public outings. When Peaches abandoned Daddy in his hotel apartment, a mere 6 months after their nuptials, the press was there to report, and in some cases fabricate, all the sordid details. In doing so, they cast their damning judgment on both parties. For his role in the debacle that was their love, Browning was often described as a fool, a predator, a sugar daddy, or any number of the combinations of the three. Meanwhile, Peaches was, almost without exception, portrayed as an opportunist and gold digger. Browning's very public dalliances with women half his age, which I didn't have time to tell you about today, but trust me, they are bizarre and they are doozies, so if you want to hear about them, seek me out. Anyway, his public dalliances with young women, as well as his fool antics to get himself invited to all high school and sorority dances, well, these already pegged him as a sucker with more bread than brains. Famed journalist Damon Runyon called him a gallus old codger and poked fun at his choice of women, his nicknames, Daddy and Bunny being but two, and his attire, as he had, quote, more neckties than sulkas with pants to match. Moreover, newspapers from coast to coast often commented on his thin white hair and his flabby yet wax-like sheen. Indeed, with his deeds, to his demeanor, to his duds, clearly Browning was a laughingstock. As for Browning's depiction as a sugar daddy, it is a name that he himself cultivated when he first asked his adoptive daughter to call him daddy. Indeed, Browning seemed to revel in the sugar daddy moniker, right? He's the OG of the sugar daddies. He gloated to the press the exorbitant sums he spent on his little women. During one shopping spree, he revealed to reporters, "Peaches is spending $1,000 a day, and it makes me love my little girl all the more." End quote. In this way, then, the discourse about these men in these case studies differ. White was, in some accounts, a benefactor, a term that implies not only money and influence and power, but also prestige and wisdom, something that really only an older man could afford to have. Such was not the case with Browning, as his advanced years only brought him ridicule. Browning was the quintessential sugar daddy. He was a harmless fool, an impotent sucker who used his wealth to hide his inadequacies, sexual and otherwise. At a time when there was, as historian Gilman Ostrander called it, a premium on youth, Browning had two strikes against him. First, at 51, he was old. Secondly, he acted as if he was unaware of that fact. Browning defended himself to the papers. "I'm not an old man seeking improper friendship with little girls," he said. "I'm a young man." Not surprisingly, no one agreed with him. Even his obituary chided him for failing to, quote, place himself and his years in the proper perspective, end quote. As one letter to the editor bluntly stated, quote, "Age is age and youth is youth, and never the twain shall meet," end quote. And what of the women in these case studies? Well, as already mentioned, in most contemporary accounts, Nesbit's young age and frail sex were characteristics used to help create her in the image of an innocent child. Heenan, on the other hand, had people on her side, even at the start of her relationship with Browning, right? Had few people on her side. The papers not so subtly question her motives from the beginning. But Heenan, too, helped create and then perpetuate her characterization as a gold digger. Days after her wedding, she told the press, quote, "We've been married a week and I've spent $7,000. Isn't it wonderful?" End quote. Naturally, abandoning her husband without warning, reportedly leaving him with only a stack of store receipts totaling in the thousands of dollars, also did not help her shake her reputation as a woman only interested in money. Realizing how she must look, at one point during her whirlwind courtship to Browning, Heenan told the press that she was no adventuress who was marrying Browning for his money. "Neither," she continued, "am I marrying him for career." No. In Peach's own words, quote, "I don't want a career, but only want a home and a man with whom I can discuss serious things for hours," end quote. Thus, in one case, the age-gender duality was used to classify Nesbit in sympathetic terms. In the other instance, it was a telltale sign of Heenan's gold-digging motivations. Now, my larger project, of which this is part, links these changing attitudes toward May-December unions to young male fears about the increasing presence and consequent acceptance of female sexuality, economic and political power, as well as to the growing generational conflict caused by the appearance of a youth culture that was constantly challenged by older generations. Thus, terms like gold digger, right, that is the young woman in an age-disparate relationship, emerged and defined a woman as a dangerous siren whose aggressive sexuality belied her true desire to strip men of their money and their manliness. On the other hand, the sugar daddy, that is the older male partner, was a harmless fool, an impotent sucker who used his wealth to hide his inadequacies. If the way we talk about these aged and gendered persons in history is not foul, I don't know what is. And that's because such generalizations help negate power of younger women and older men at a time when it is unclear how young men, responding to both groups of people, would carve out a place for themselves in American society. By simply writing off young women and old men as bad, the young man, steps into more power. There is a reason we remember the 1920s as a time of frivolity and excess, because they are often defined against the roles we put upon young women. so therefore they're easy to dismiss. Conversely, the movers and shakers of the era, right, the gangsters, the G-men, the Gatsbys, these young men are the ones who made history, right? And old men and women, well, as you can see, they're not even in the picture. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to hearing any comments and answering any questions.